The above lightboard video that you hopefully just watched gives an overview of the difference between aerobic and anaerobic activity. And what fuel we use during physical activity is in part dependent on whether an activity is anaerobic, which is typically high intensity or at the beginning of exercise, or aerobic, which is for the majority of exercise, especially exercises at a low to moderate intensity. One of the ways we can talk about fuel use is to compare it to the duration of exercise. We preferentially use certain fuels during certain parts of exercise. The first 2 minutes of exercise, we are in an anaerobic state, which means that we have a limited choice of which fuels we can use. We have a small amount of ATP that's found in our tissues that can fuel exercise, but it's gone almost immediately. And then a system called the Creatine Phosphate ATP system can help replenish that ATP to fuel those anaerobic activities once ATP is depleted. I'll talk about that on the next slide. After that, something called anaerobic glycolysis kicks in. And this is the anaerobic breakdown of glucose, which, remember, produces pyruvate plus some ATP. After about 2 minutes, we get more into our aerobic zone and our aerobic metabolism, the aerobic metabolism of both glucose and lipids, that which we learned about in chapter 3 during cellular respiration. That is the predominant way we get fuel. Like I mentioned, at the beginnings of exercise, we use up ATP really quickly, and then something called creatine phosphate, which we have at our tissues, can help replenish it. Creatine phosphate, as the name implies, has a phosphate group that once removed can be used to replenish adenosine diphosphate, two phosphate groups that doesn't have that extra phosphate group for ATP. Okay, that phosphate group from creatine phosphate, when removed from creatine, can combine with adenosine diphosphate to reform adenosine triphosphate, and again keep fueling those beginnings of physical activity, especially in that anaerobic zone. Like we mentioned, after the ATP and creatine phosphate system has kind of been used up, then the anaerobic breakdown of glucose predominates. And remember, glucose is the only dietary fuel that can be used for anaerobic activity. Remember how this happens. Glucose is broken down into pyruvate, and instead of pyruvate going on to form acetyl-CoA, during anaerobic conditions, pyruvate forms lactate and some ATP, which can fuel physical activity for a limited amount of time. After the first 2 minutes of exercise, that's when our aerobic fuel use starts. And the main fuels that are going to be used aerobically are lipids and glucose. Notice protein hasn't even come in yet. Okay, that's because protein is not really a fuel for physical activity. It fuels a very small percentage of physical activity. Okay, in the first hour of exercise, past that first 2 minutes, our muscle glycogen and our blood glucose, these are the things that are supplying glucose for aerobic glycolysis. But you'll notice that aerobic use of glucose goes down at increasing durations of physical activity. We also get lipids for aerobic metabolism, and we get these lipids from some of the lipids that are stored at the muscle and the lipids that are broken down from our fat cells. And you'll notice as time goes on, the longer you exercise, the greater proportion of our energy is coming from our lipids compared to glucose. Okay. Another thing that affects which type of fuel we use beyond duration is exercise intensity. Okay. At low exercise intensities, we are in the aerobic zone, and in general, lipids become the main fuel source. As the intensity increase, you'll notice that the amount of energy that comes from lipids decreases, and the amount of energy that comes from glucose increases. So anaerobic activities, those that are at high intensity, remember they can only really use the dietary fuel of glucose. Okay. However, during high intensity activities, I still have some oxygen available. I just don't have enough. So I'm still going to be doing some aerobic lipid metabolism as well to fuel those activities. So this slide gives you an overview of what fuels we use at different durations of exercise, depending on whether that exercise is high intensity or moderate intensity. Okay, so it's another way I could split this up is what do I use for anaerobic activities versus aerobic activities, which are more at the low to moderate zone. So hopefully this can help you organize all of those concepts together.